next speaker is Dr. Robert Fuller. He received his Ph.D. in physics from Princeton University, and he has also served as the president of Oberlin College. He is also an internationally recognized authority on dignity and rankism, and today he will be presenting his talk titled Somebodies and Nobodies, Overcoming the Rankism that Poisons Relationships.
Relationships take many forms. They can be personal, interpersonal relationships, relationships you have with friends and family. Or it can be relationships between groups like conservatives and progressives, blacks and whites, males and females. Or it can be relationships between nations, the U.S., USSR. That relationship was central to my life, but it went through a gigantic change 20 years ago, and now we pay very little attention to it. We pay more attention to the relationship, say, between the U.S. and China. Now, all these relationships can be good or bad. They can be poisonous, they can be toxic. And I've spent most of my life trying to figure out why. What is it that makes relationships awful? And what's the antidote to poisonous relationships? The poison I've given a name to. I call it rankism. And it's what people who feel superior do to people who they take to be their inferiors. In shorthand, it's what somebodies do to nobodies. You've probably been a victim of it. Almost everyone has been treated like a nobody in one place or another. You've probably, unless you're a saint, also dished out a certain amount of rankism, treating someone else as like a nobody. Where this began for me is way back in second grade, when I was 7. I went to a school in the shadow of Bell Laboratories, and there were a lot of the parents of my friends worked in this great research institution, and there were other kids from the same area who were the sons and daughters of farmers. Every morning, our second grade class began with an inspection of our fingernails. Believe it or not, you had to hold out your hands like this, and the teacher would go around and look at your fingernails, and if they were dirty, you were thrown out of the classroom for the whole day. And one day, Arlene was expelled from the classroom and told to stand in the hall until her fingernails were clean. I immediately wondered, how can she clean them out there? What was the real purpose of putting her in the hall? And it must have occurred to me even then that the purpose was to shame her and scare the rest of us. Because Arlene was a farmer's daughter. She had only one dress, a red one, that she wore every day. She spoke in a whisper. She looked undernourished. She was a perfect victim because she couldn't fight back. When I went home that day, I told my mother what had happened to Arlene. You can be sure my mother made sure that my fingernails were clean from then on. And had I been thrown in the hall, I think the teacher would have gotten a dose of my mother and would have backed down because my mom was on the school board. In other words, I was protected. Arlene was weak, vulnerable, unprotected. There were other kids who were unprotected too in my school. I'm talking now about the 40s and the 50s, prior to the Civil Rights Revolution, prior to the women's movement. One of the kids that was unprotected was Frank. We didn't have the word gay in our vocabulary then, but we thought there was something odd about Frank. And he was teased mercilessly. So was Jimmy, who was a Down syndrome boy, who was not allowed in the school, who would stand outside the fence and look through the fence at the kids going to school and face ridicule every day. There were only 2 kids in my whole class of 100 kids who were fat, Trudy and Tommy, and they were ridiculed. They were made fun of. There was no defense for these people. The relationships they were in were poisoned. Another interesting group, remarkable by its absence, were blacks. There were no blacks in my school in New Jersey, 0. The realtors of the town had an agreement that nobody knew about that kept blacks and Indians from India, anyone with dark skin, out of the town, therefore they weren't in the school. But when our basketball team would go to adjacent towns to play other teams, we would encounter black players. And the N-word could be heard being yelled out the bus window as the basketball team drove away, especially if we lost. So the white kids in my school were trying to assert their superiority, at least socially, even though they may have lost the basketball game. That's an example of what I call rankism. It's pulling rank. It's taking yourself to be superior to other people, to be a somebody and treating other people like nobodies. Victims of rankism suffer degradation, abuse. The nobodies I've given as examples so far have all been members of a visible class. You can tell a black person they're black. You can't always tell a gay person, but you can maybe guess or at least assert it regardless of whether it's true. You can tell a person with a disability, but most of us, whether we have one of those defining traits or not, have been nobody. Emily Dickinson wrote a wonderful little poem for the nobodies of the world. It goes like this: I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, don't tell. They banish us, you know. So she picked up on the fact that what it is that's operating in the nobody-somebody distinction is the threat of banishment, the threat of exclusion, the threat of humiliation and indignity. That is the poison that affects relationships, whether between people, between groups of people, or between nations. And that is the poison we have got to become alert to and rid ourselves of during your lifetime. Because that poison is the most dangerous thing in the world. Humiliation is more dangerous than plutonium. It's damaging, and it has this feature that it excites the will to respond in kind. When you're humiliated, what you want to do is get even. But often you don't dare because the person who humiliated you has more power than you do. Might be your boss, might be a teacher, might be just a big tough kid. People who indulge in rankism usually do so because they think they can get away with it, because we let them get away with it. When I was a kid, it was possible to humiliate blacks and people of color and Asians with impunity. You could get away with it in the America of mid-century, mid-20th century. Then something amazing happened. the most amazing thing in my lifetime wasn't winning World War II. It was overcoming racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, ageism. It was taking on these successive isms that had been used to put down whole groups of people successfully. And various leaders arose who showed us how to organize a surpassing power. You don't get rid of an ism by moralizing. You get rid of one by organizing a superior power and forcing the people who are indulging in it to back down. That takes time and organization, it takes leadership, it takes guts. But it happened from the 50s through the 80s, even into the 90s. And my generation basically overcame a half a dozen isms. But there's one huge ism left. And I call it rankism because it happens outside of those simpler isms, which all have a defining trait or characteristic, which is used as an excuse to indulge in them. These isms I encountered in grad school, at Princeton actually, where I was in math and physics, and the other 100 grad students were all drawn from the best schools. They were all white. Princeton did not admit blacks when I went there in the 50s. Zero. And I encountered rankism there because the game that defined that place was one-upmanship. The game was not so much a search for truth as a search for status. So people were constantly trying to demonstrate that other people were stupid. And the way you would do this is, if you asked a question, they were apt to say, oh, that's trivial. Meaning, you must be awfully dumb or you would already have understood it. And that was the first place, being a tall, white, straight male, that I ever encountered rankism. I wasn't vulnerable to the other types, but I sure was vulnerable to that kind of rankism. And discovered how damaging it was to be a victim of it. Cleverness was the trait that was involved there, actually. Now, by this point, I've given you my answer. I've told you what poisons relationships is rankism. You might think that what poisons relationships is rank itself, but it isn't. Rank isn't a problem when it's earned in a fair, equal competition. Rank actually, we love people of high rank if they don't treat us with indignity, if they respect our dignity. Rank serves a purpose. When you get on the plane, you want the pilot to fly the plane, not the flight attendant. When you take math, you want the math teacher to teach the course, not the baseball coach. Rank tells us what experiences you've had and your qualifications. So rank isn't the problem. We respect presidents like George Washington, who didn't take his rank too seriously, and who knew that 2 terms were enough, who gave up his rank. Rankism is the problem. It's the abuse of rank that's the problem, and it's a very big problem. Rankism is what can block the cooperation that was on these slides just before my turn. Rankism makes you want to sabotage the company, not cooperate with the other members in it. If your boss is a bully, you're more apt to steal paper clips and pens and everything else you get. Actually, half of you want him to fail. Companies that succeed are companies that get rid of the rankism, don't tolerate it, treat everybody with respect, everybody with dignity. Now, by this point, you're probably saying, almost everyone does when they hear this analysis, But isn't rankism human nature? How can we hope to get rid of it? If I hadn't seen racism go from something everyone took for granted to something that is the quickest way you can think of to lose your job, if I hadn't seen it go from that to that in one lifetime, I would think rankism was human nature too. But we've gotten rid of a half a dozen forms of rankism already. What we haven't done is gotten rid of the root cause of all those forms of rankism, all the familiar isms. And so my answer to the question, isn't rankism human nature, is to say, yes, it is human nature, but human nature isn't fixed. Human nature is incredibly malleable. And it changes, not day to day. You can't see the changes in a day or a week, but you can see them easily over a lifetime. Let me use my own family as an example of this. I'm old enough to have known my great-grandparents and to have grandchildren myself. That's 6 generations. I'm going to take racism as the example. My great-grandparents were regarded racial slurs as self-evident truths. My grandparents were racist, for sure, and they used the N-word in private, but not in public. My parents did not use the N-word. They were politically correct, but I could tell they were racist in their hearts. But because they didn't use the N-word, my brothers and I did not have to unlearn the N-word. I was a supporter of civil rights, but to be honest about it, I at first found it puzzling certain slogans like "Black is beautiful." Think about it. I had never seen a black model. So initially it was puzzling to me. But I kept an open mind, and I ended up, just like all of us, seeing beauty in every kind of human being. My kids dated interracially. My grandchildren are actually a mixed race. That's 6 generations. It takes that long to overcome an ism. My grandchildren are bored with yet another Martin Luther King Day. They've already had 10 of them, you know, they're tired of them. They come around too often. That actually is a good sign. The issue just holds no energy for them. It takes 6 generations to overcome an ism. That's a long time, but it's not forever. It's going to take that long to overcome rankism. It has been our human nature to prey on the weak. We are a predator species. We're not just a predator species. We're great at it. We're the worst, best predators so far the world has ever seen. And we turn those tactics on each other. We have got to stop. I'm here today to tell you, it's your job, your generation has got to put an end to that, because it will destroy the world if we don't. I said before, humiliation is more dangerous than plutonium. The difference is, the quote-unquote nobodies of the world now have plutonium. So there are 2 reasons we need to give up rankism. First, the nobodies aren't weak anymore. They can get even. They will get even. One of the most important aspects of a strong defense is not to get offense in the first place. We've got to stop doing that to each other as individuals, groups, and internationally. Not to is to risk our own future. Finally, there's this wonderful fact about dignity. It works. When you treat your employees with dignity, they work harder for you. When you treat each other with dignity, your marriages work. When you don't, they fail. When we treat other nations with dignity, they won't want to get even with us. They'll return it in kind. They'll return dignity for dignity. Near the end of your life, 70-odd years from now, if you could look back on it and say, okay, my grandparents got rid of racism and sexism and they're a bore right now, but what we did is we identified and got rid of rankism. We made it uncool. If you can say that, you will have saved the world. We are the biggest danger to ourselves. The residue of our predatory behavior is a tremendous threat to us. And we've made a whole lot of progress as a species of pruning it out of our behavior, but we're at a tipping point where we now have to really focus on it and not tolerate it. And that means that you cannot even humiliate a perpetrator of rankism. That's more rankism. You have to find a way of correcting rankist behavior without being rankist yourself. And it's often difficult. The only thing that's as important as how we treat the earth is how we treat each other.